Hey everyone, it's EverythingeeB here. When you think of iPads, you probably think about the latest iPad Pros, the latest iPad Airs, or even the regular student-made iPad. But I kinda don't have the money to buy a brand new iPad. So what do I do if I want to use an iPad without having to pay the awfully high prices for a brand new iPad? I use an older one. This is an iPad 2nd generation, released in 2011 and pretty much improved everything about its predecessor by adding cameras, a dual-core processor, and a lot of other small improvements. But it's been 10 years since this iPad has been released, and there's obviously have been a lot more recent and more powerful iPads that have come out. So this really begs the question, what can you do with a 10-year-old iPad in 2021? So this iPad has a lot more backstory than just being the iPad I am reviewing today. I've been using this iPad since around 2012. It was originally my uncle's iPad until he upgraded to an iPhone 7 and gave this to me. The first thing that you probably noticed about the iPad is probably the display. It hasn't been glued down yet. It actually used to be cracked, but then I replaced it. However, the power button doesn't work and the Wi-Fi is limited because of 2 cables that I broke while repairing the device. I'm an idiot. So I didn't glue it down. It still works decently fine though, so I can continue to review it. So let's get more into the usage part of the iPad. The last version of iOS it ever got was iOS 9.3.5 because it's a Wi-Fi iPad, not a cellular one. This version of iOS, however, is very slow on this generation of iOS devices, the A5 generation. And I really don't blame it. The tech specs are way too weak to handle a modernish OS with modern applications. It has a 1 GHz dual-core A5 at either 45 or 32 nanometers. It also has 512 MB of VRAM or RAM, and a dual-core PowerVR graphics chip. Despite device with these chips, referring to the A5, were reduced to a qual with iOS 9 and its new features. Here's a clip right now of how slow the iPad can get with iOS 9. It's not ideal if I actually want to use the iPad in 2021, so I downgraded the iPad to iOS 8. It's not much faster either, it feels a bit slow for my liking, but it is definite improvement over iOS 9. Now let's get to the actual usage part of the iPad. I'm going to be testing different aspects of the iPad. I'm going to be testing general usage, communication, media consumption, media creation, third-party apps, gaming, and to top it all off, I'm going to be testing battery life. This should really be exciting, or not. Let's kick things off with general usage. Navigating around the iOS interface isn't really taxing at all for this iPad. It does feel a bit sluggish while opening and using apps, but other than that, it is perfectly fine. If you want to do any web browsing on this iPad, you are pretty much stuck using Safari 8 or 9 depending on what version of iOS you are running. Either way, installing another browser won't make any difference because these other browsers are limited by the system specs of the iPad with its 512 MB of RAM. But web browsing isn't really all that bad to begin with, at least for now. Websites do load slower than a PC or a newer iPad would load them, but it still loads most websites without a hitch. Other than that, things like checking your email also works alright. For this I used the Gmail app as I was having stability issues with the built-in mail app on iOS. Although emails will load quite slowly, they still do load, which I would say is the important part. One thing you definitely won't be able to do on this iPad though is multitask. The iPad pretty much limits you to having 1 or 2 apps open at the same time due to that abysmally low 512 MB of RAM. Kind of disappointment, I know, but that's just how the dice rolls. I also tried Apple's Office Suite for this part of the video. I've never actually used Pages, Numbers, and Keynotes before, so I actually was pretty decently excited to try it out. I guess it worked exactly like it was supposed to. I could type documents, albeit with a big lag due to the iPad syncing with the cloud, but I still could type them. I also tried syncing with OneNote and typing with OneNote. The experience was a bit sluggish, but otherwise alright, since that is also syncing with OneDrive at the same time, so it will obviously be sluggish. Now let's move on to communication. This iPad was actually the first to have 2 cameras on it, meaning that communicating with others was, for the first time, actually possible on this iPad. iMessage works pretty well. In fact, I would make this iPad my daily iMessage machine if it weren't for the fact that it's running an older and slower version of iMessage. FaceTime also happens to work as well, although that 0.3 megapixel camera will make you look like a blurry mess, worse than a laptop camera. The latest version of Zoom installs on iOS as well. This I was extremely surprised about, as Xcode has discontinued iOS 8 for a while now, so I don't exactly know why Zoom never updated their application. Either way, the iPad also works as a Zoom machine. I haven't tested other communication programs due to the lack of those on an older version of iOS. Now it is time for us to transition to media consumption. This is really kind of a mixed bag with this iPad. By media consumption, I really mean social media, video media, basically anything with the word media on it. So let's start with the very social version of it. Social media has really far gone this iPad. TikTok might actually work, but in all honesty, I would just forget about watching TikTok on an iPad unless you were desperate. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram all don't work as far as I can tell, so that eliminates those three in terms of media consumption. The YouTube app has stopped working, but with a few modifications I can actually try and get it to work. Also, the web version of YouTube still does work, and playback is pretty smooth at 720p resolution. Netflix of course works. I find that Netflix actually holds on to older devices longer than its competitors such as Prime Video and Hulu. It does take a while to load, but the important part is that it does load, and when it does, you can watch pretty much anything. In terms of music consumption, thankfully this iPad supports Spotify and Apple Music on this version of iOS. I tested both and they both seem to be working just fine. I haven't noticed any strange behavior while listening to music. So next, we're going to move on to media creation. Now this should definitely be interesting, as this is a 10-year-old iPad we're trying to create media with. Yes, this iPad was designed to create media, not just to consume it, and that was one of its main selling points. First up, we have GarageBand. This is one of the three programs that Apple released for iOS with this iPad when it came out. And GarageBand works perfectly fine. It just works exactly like GarageBand is supposed to work, I guess. iMovie just flat up stopped working after importing media from iCloud. So that's pretty much a fail right there. In fact, the whole app has now been bricked because of one photo I took on my iPhone 5. Photo editing actually works really well. Using Photoshop Express, I managed to edit a photo just to my liking. Third-party apps is a very mixed subject. We'll start it off with me stating the obvious. Nearly every single app in the store has been updated to not support iOS 8 or 9 anymore. You will have to download older versions of every single app you find. That said, the older versions are kind of a hit or miss. You can find apps that work, apps that don't, and apps that just crash on their final update. So I'll start with apps that work. Google Maps actually worked, although the app is very laggy loading up the intensive maps. It does still work, and turn-by-turn navigation isn't that bad. Red also worked pretty well, although I couldn't figure out how to comment on any posts. The Weather Network also did work, but since I couldn't get the iPad version, as the newest device I have is an iPhone 6s, everything was super blown up. Gmail also worked pretty well, as I said earlier. Finally, OneNote also worked really well, but syncing cloud notes with the cloud would take absolutely forever, like I mentioned earlier. Now we can move on to apps that just flat out didn't work. iMovie, of course, started to crash after importing media, so that's just a broken app. Wikipedia can't connect to its servers at all, something I find very strange as the iOS 6 version was working just a few months ago. Discord would just crash when I was trying to load my friends list, which is a problem with the iOS 8 version of the app. It's not limited to the iPad 2, it also happens on the iPhone 5. So I'll try and find an older version that does work and update you on that. Finally, let's move on to the last category, gaming. It's kind of weird on this iPad as it's very hit or miss, so I'll keep this intro part simple. Some games like Geometry Dash and LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga worked. Then there were games like Minecraft and GTA San Andreas that just ran really awfully or just crashed. I'll have game footage right now for you to see for yourself. Finally, we'll talk about battery. This iPad has had around 800 charge cycles in its lifetime and is at least 68% for capacity. However, this battery is actually really good. It's enough to last a whole day on heavy usage and last several days on light usage. I don't have the battery page to show as it didn't work by the time I had to film this video, but it lasted at least 4 days before I had to plug it in on light usage. That is really impressive. It can also charge overnight to 100, and that's on a 5-watt charger, so this thing is an absolute powerhouse if you want battery life. So finally we arrived at the conclusion of this video, and it's this: if you want a super budget iPad, we're talking around like $50 here, for doing some light tasks and you have patience to sit through loading screens, this iPad works really well. It really does a good job for a 10-year-old iPad. If this video does well, I will do a video on using iOS 6 in 2021. Until then, I will see you all next time. If you didn't like what you saw, don't subscribe. It really hurts my channel. Until then, see you next time.